Hi, it's Jason from Fraser Valley Rose Farm. I'm back with my Rose Care by the Month series, and of course this is Rose Care for November. My roses are looking very calm and sedate. There's far fewer flowers, there's less growth, and in fact the whole landscape is turning yellow and orange, so pretty calm month, except there's still a ton to do in the rose garden. I break these videos into 6 subtopics, as you'll see on the screen right now, and the first of those is main activities, and there are a lot of activities for November, the first of which is to cut back or secure roses from winter damage, from wind primarily or snow load. And as I've shown in this visual here, a strong fall wind or winter wind can take down plants in a way you might not have expected, reveal their weak points. Roses are no different. They have some of those long whippy stems that need cutting back at this time of year, or you need to secure them. Let me show you. Here's an example of a tall, poorly supported cane that is more liable to be damaged by winter winds or snow load. This is probably in the range of 6 feet tall. It's a nice healthy cane. So if this were a climber and I had a fence here, I'd probably just tie it up and keep it for next year. But as is, I think it's going to be damaged. So I'm going to take it down to a height where I think it's going to be less likely to be damaged. Anywhere in this range is fine, say from hip height up to chest height, depending on your climate and the kind of winds that you get. So I'm just going to choose a spot here that's more in line with the rest of the shrub and cut it down there. Now the timing I've chosen for this, of course, is November, after I've had some cold and it's slowed down the growth on the plant. If I did this kind of cutting in, say, September, it might encourage fresh new growth, which isn't what I'm after. I'm trying to get it to shut down and slow down and be well supported for the season. I really don't have to do something to every rose. If it's an appropriate height and well balanced, I don't have to do a thing. It's only where I see issues with it being supported over the winter that I'll give it a little nip. So this activity really doesn't take that much time. Well, how about this one here? It's obviously pretty long too, and also susceptible to winter damage, but this is on a rambling rose and I have a support right here. So instead of cutting it back, I'm just going to tie it up with some twine. My second main activity for the month of November is to take these roses that are in containers around my yard, put them into this cart and move them right up next to the house. I'm putting them there so that I can tuck them into the garage for protection in case there's a deep cold in the forecast. Now, some people who are in much colder climates will actually take their container roses, put them inside the garage for the entire time, either in a minimally heated structure or a shed or something like that, just to protect them from the cold and wind once they've gone dormant. But as you can see, these ones are still in active growth, and probably in my climate, they don't need that kind of protection during the whole winter. They just need it for those stretches where I have deep cold forecast. So I'm moving them up beside the house. The other thing to watch out for is that if I put them beside the house, I don't want to put them in a spot where they're beside the eaves and the water is dripping down into the containers, keeping them saturated for extended periods during the winter. Speaking of protecting roses in containers, this is my greenhouse and these roses are being prepared for sale next year. And the reason I've put them into tight groups like this is so that they can be put under crop cover, which is a specified width. And so if the weather threatens deep cold during the winter, I'll be able to throw an extra layer of crop cover, and that will ensure that I bring them through the winter in the best possible condition. So what about protecting roses in your landscape, not just the ones that are in containers? Well, owing to a more consistent soil temperature and better establishment, more resources in the plant, the ones in the ground are less affected by the cold. That doesn't mean that you may not have to protect them. It depends on how hardy the rose is, what it's rated to, and what your climate is. I'm in zone 8, so all of my roses in the landscape here are well suited to this climate. I make it through the winter, even with a slightly harsher than average temperature, with minimal losses, so I don't really have to worry about established roses. But what about young roses like this one here? This one just went in the ground this spring. It's still quite small and it's not a super hardy variety. So if I'm worried about it and going into the winter, if I see one of those deep cold sections coming in the forecast, I'm going to cover it. In this case, I'm just covering it with a large nursery pot and a rock on top. Now you can get things that are specifically made for this, things like styrofoam igloos or fabric little tents that go over your roses. The more classic way to do it is just to hill over with the soil around the base of the rose, and they do that in harsher climates or harder winter climates pretty routinely on tender type roses. I'll give you an example. Up in the Summerland garden, which I visited before, they have the Canadian style roses. They've gone years and years without protection, no problems at all. A few minutes away in Penticton, they have hybrid tea roses. Same climate, but a more tender variety of rose. And the only thing that saved those roses last year when we had a deep cold is that they religiously hill over the soil around the bases of those roses over the winter, and that protects the crown. Now, when I come out of that deep cold, I'm going to go ahead and uncover this again and just leave it open to the elements. Again, most of my roses have no problem with a quick dip below freezing at any point during the year. It's only when you have deeper freezing temperatures that you have to protect them. And in general, they're better off with better air circulation and natural conditions over the winter, at least in this climate. Section 2 of my rose care videos usually focuses on soil and fertilizer. Let's talk about fertilizer this time of year. Your roses don't need to be pushed in growth. So out in the landscape or in natural conditions, I've been holding off the fertilizer for a number of months now. Only in the greenhouse where I have plants in active growth or indoors am I giving them kind of a maintenance dose of fertilizer. So discussion over, right? Well, the one thing I will point out is that this is a pretty good time of year if you have access to soil testing services and they're reasonably priced to get a soil test in your garden. You probably would not be adding nitrogen fertilizer at this time of year no matter what. Nitrate forms tend to leach through the soil, ammonia forms tend to volatilize, so your roses will not get the advantage of it. But if you take a soil test and you're short of something stickier, longer lasting in the garden, let's say something like potassium, then that might be a good time to supplement your potassium at this time of year when it has time to work its way down into the soil. So a soil test is not a bad idea. However, I have to say that if you take a generally balanced approach to fertilizing through the season, sticking mainly to organic amendments and just bumping up your nitrogen levels as needed by your plants, you really don't have to fuss too much on micromanaging your soil nutrients. But that said, if you're in a spot where the soil tests are free through your extension service or low cost and it comes with recommendations, I would take advantage of that service in a second. Section 3 that I'll address in these monthly videos has to do with watering, and I may talk more about that in the summer months, but in the winter like this, where it's wetter and colder, the needs have dropped way down on my roses. I will mention at this point though that November might be my last chance to go around assessing and seeing if my roses have adequate drainage. So if I walk around the landscape and I see standing water now, that's not going to get better during the winter, and this would be my kind of final chance to go and pull that rose up, put it in a container and overwinter it that way instead of leaving it in a mucky pit over the winter. So drainage more so than watering at this point. Okay, so I'm always going to try to squeeze in some conversation about propagation. Do you remember those long stems that we pulled off of roses at the beginning of this video because they would be damaged in the wind? Those are actually, if they're fully ripened stems at this time of year, they should be pretty ripe, which means that the wood is firm. Then you can take cuttings off of it like this. Now, I have a whole other video on hardwood propagation methods. I'm going to link that above here so you can look at that as a separate topic. But yes, you can definitely do it with the clippings that you take off of roses or that break off of roses at this time of year in windstorms. Take those, cut them into sections, dip them into rooting hormone, and you stick them into the soil right here in the garden in a semi-shaded location, cool, moist soil, and just leave them alone. It's a kind of propagation that takes very, very little effort and input from your part, so it's actually kind of a cool way of propagating plants. Your success rate is lower than the semi-hardwood cuttings that I do during the active growing season. Speaking of which, I do have some trades that came in from customers out in Victoria and gave me some cuttings off of some rare roses, so I am continuing to do semi-hardwood cuttings indoors in controlled circumstance and controlled environment. So that is something you can definitely do indoors with semi-hardwood cuttings, but for the completely ripened stems, you would do that outdoors here as a hardwood cutting. Now, I will mention that this is not your final chance to do hardwood cuttings for the year. The ones that go into the soil right now actually tend to wait a little bit before putting on any callus or roots, all the way until January or so when they begin developing. So if you wanted to add some more in December, in January, as long as you do it well before they start setting up their new buds and shooting, that's usually about the prime time is, again, November, December, January, at least in my climate. Moving on to pests and disease now, we change in that part of the year from things that you can easily see, like black spot and powdery mildew on the foliage, aphids at the tips of your plants, to those things that you can't easily see. They're overwintering stages, the spores and the eggs that they lay. So that's what's happening in your garden at this time of year. It's less obvious, but still a concern for you. And so I like to use this time of year to do a little bit of sanitation. You're not going to do it immediately. It's usually better to let nature take down the foliage a little bit so that at the end you can scoop up those leaves, replace the layer of mulch, and try to sanitize the stems, the bare stems of your roses. Something you will need for that, and I'm asking you to go look for it now, is what kind of dormant spray you're allowed to use in your jurisdiction. The sort of the general flavors of this, there's sulfur-based ones like lime sulfur, there's copper-based sprays like Bordeaux mix, and then there's also horticultural oils. Now, what you're allowed to use in your area may vary quite a lot, so right now is the time to do that research and then to find out what you can get and to source it before you do your spring pruning, and then you'll have your dormant spray on hand to take care of right at that point. Dormant sprays that I just mentioned are pretty safe to be around for humans, and some of them are even considered organic, but they are actually applied at such a rate as to be disinfectant. So they're applied to the plant when it's dormant and they aren't going to damage the leaves, but what they will do is they will knock down those pest populations from overwinter. So they're pretty strong, and you want to use them in the most targeted possible way, just on your roses and not on the surrounding gardens. You actually want the beneficial insects to survive this, and they won't when directly sprayed. So you'll spray your roses, but you're not trying to spray everything in the garden and sanitize the whole thing. You're just targeting the rose itself. You're removing the leaves from the base. You're removing any excess leaves. You're doing your clean pruning, and you're trying to get your roses into the next season as clean as possible, at least to start. Final section here is a plant spotlight, and while the minis look good and some of the cluster flowering ramblers also are hanging in there, this one is called the Fairy and it stands alone. It's a garden classic, cluster flowering, pink, tough as nails, and look what it's doing going into November. So that's fantastic. Well, that's it for my rose care in November video. I admit it was a bit of a busy one, but things calmed down quite a bit in December and January, all the way up till February, when we are planning that dormant spray application, the cleanup and the pruning. So that's another busy month. So in December and January, maybe we'll use that time to get into some plant selection and planning. All right, thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please drop those down in the comments below the video. I'll see what I can do to help.